establishing central space immediately, aiming for rapid piece development and potential queen's pawn opening advantages. Developing the knight to f6 immediately challenges white's central pawn and prepares for flexible pawn structures. Establishing central dominion, white immediately contests black's knight and begins to sculpt a commanding pawn structure. Preparing a kingside fianchetto, this move embraces a flexible structure, potentially leading to dynamic play and control of the dark squares. Developing the knight here solidifies central influence and prepares kingside castling, aiming for rapid piece activity. Developing the bishop to its most active diagonal, this move prepares to castle and controls the central light squares. Establishing a solid pawn chain and preparing kingside castling, white solidifies their central presence while keeping options open. Solidifying the pawn structure, this move gracefully prepares to challenge the center and open lines for the bishop. Solidifying the center and preparing a kingside castling, this move creates a harmonious pawn triangle, subtly restricting black's development. Securing the king is paramount, liberating pieces for central engagement and future pawn advances. Securing the king's flank, this bishop development prepares for a central pawn push, eyeing the open diagonal and coordinating with its knight for future king's side operations. Establishing a knight on d7 subtly supports the central pawn structure while preparing to swing the piece over to f6 or b6, potentially challenging white's queenside pawn majority. This move prioritizes subtle piece placement and long-term development over immediate aggressive action, hinting at a solid positional struggle. Castling reinforces the monarch's safety, a prudent step in this king's Indian setup, and simultaneously brings the rook into play for future central control. Venturing e5 immediately injects central dynamism, aiming to break open the pawn structure and challenge white's kingside space advantage. Pivoting the queen to c2 develops a more active defender for the kingside and prepares to challenge the central pawn thrust, hinting at a potential pawn break with b4 to disrupt black's queenside structure. Realigning the queen to the king's flank signals a desire to prepare for kingside action, potentially aiming for a subsequent Ray8 and e4 pawn push to challenge white's central control and open lines towards the monarch. Expanding the queenside pawn structure, this maneuver prepares to bolster the kingside defense and potentially launch a flank attack later. It also subtly aims to control the c4-f7 diagonal for future piece activity. Asserting central space with that pawn thrust immediately creates a locked pawn structure, a sure sign of positional maneuvering rather than immediate tactical fireworks. Now, black's knight on f6 finds itself somewhat restricted, and the bishop on g7 might feel a little less active with its diagonal now partially blocked. This pawn push promises an interesting battle for piece mobility and potential future pawn breaks. Dislodging the knight from its central post initiates a fascinating repositioning, aiming to bolster the queenside and prepare for potential pawn advances or piece transfers. This maneuver sacrifices immediate central influence for long-term strategic flexibility, a common theme when a pawn chain like black's e4, d6, c4 starts to solidify and restrict white's central scope. White is effectively trading a potentially active knight for a more robust defensive structure and options to attack along the c-file or support a future b4 push. Sensing the cramped queenside, black repositions the rook to the open e-file, eyeing a potential pawn break or offering it for exchange to ease the pressure and prepare for kingside play. A deliberate repositioning, the bishop vacates its initial square, freeing the e-file for a potential advance while preparing to influence the long diagonal more effectively. The knight's journey to f8 signals a reassessment of black's kingside presence, aiming to reroute this piece to the g6 square, thereby reinforcing the kingside defense and potentially preparing for a central pawn push like c5 or e4 expansion. This maneuver, while seemingly passive, is a subtle positional adjustment, seeking to improve the coordination of black's pieces and address any lingering weaknesses around the monarch that might have arisen from the earlier e-pawn advance. Consolidating the rook's influence onto the central e-file, this maneuver aims to prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside or to support a central breakthrough, while also freeing up the f1 bishop to potentially find a more active diagonal, perhaps towards the vulnerable black king. The bishop returns to a more active square, eyeing the now slightly compromised kingside and aiming to disrupt white's knight maneuvers, potentially preparing a future kingside pawn advance. A subtle repositioning, the queen retreats to b1, not to attack directly, but to exert influence along the long diagonal and to potentially support a future c5 push, or to avoid being a target on c2. This maneuver subtly shifts white's pressure point, aiming to unbalance black's compact setup. The pawn chain on the kingside is solidified, and white seems to be preparing a slow, grinding positional assault rather than a swift tactical strike. Observe how the white queen's new home offers flexibility, allowing for a possible rerouting to the queenside or even a swift redeployment if the central tension breaks open. It's a testament to the beauty of prophylaxis, subtly anticipating and nullifying black's latent threats while building white's own long-term advantages. Black initiates an ambitious pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious piece development and potentially create attacking chances against the white king. This aggressive thrust challenges the established pawn structure and signals a clear intent to seize the initiative, even at the cost of potentially weakening their own king's safety slightly in the process. Repositioning the bishop to d1 aims to activate it along the long diagonal, potentially supporting a future kingside pawn push or even a knight transfer to a more active square. The knight's repositioning to h7, seemingly a detour, hints at a subtle ambition to challenge the imposing white bishop on b2 and potentially create a kingside pawn storm, aiming to dislodge the queenside rook from the e-file. Repositions the bishop to a more flexible square, eyeing the kingside diagonal and potentially freeing the rook on the a1h8 diagonal for future action. The knight embarks on an audacious journey, aiming to disrupt white's cozy setup and exploit the somewhat exposed dark squares around the king. This maneuver injects immediate dynamism into the position, challenging the established pawn chains and potentially opening new lines of attack. Observe how the piece repositions itself, not just for a single strike, but to create options for further piece deployment and to complicate white's defensive arrangements. It's a bold statement of intent, forcing white to reassess their spatial advantages and consider threats they might have previously overlooked. Initiating an aggressive pawn thrust with f3 aims to disrupt black's bishop placement and potentially open lines for white's attack. But it also subtly weakens the kingside diagonal, creating latent vulnerabilities that black might exploit later if white isn't careful. A crucial pawn exchange unravels the queenside structure, potentially opening lines for white's pieces to infiltrate black's territory. Opening the g-file offers a decisive path toward black's king, a sharp contrast to the previous maneuvering. The recapture on g2 immediately opens up the f-file, presenting a tantalizing avenue for your rook to infiltrate the king's defenses, potentially leading to a swift mating attack if white's king remains exposed. The king, having abandoned its sanctuary, now occupies a precarious central stage, a bold statement of confidence or perhaps a desperate gamble, immediately inviting the attention of black's repositioned knights and the watchful bishop. Opening the g-file creates a powerful direct assault line toward white's monarch, exposing it significantly while simultaneously transforming the pawn structure into a far more dynamic, albeit somewhat exposed, configuration. Unleashing the queen in this moment transforms the immediate landscape, not just by reclaiming material, but by forcing a dramatic reevaluation of black's exposed king position and the nascent weaknesses scattered across the queenside following the pawn capture. The knight's repositioning to h7, while seemingly passive, is a subtle attempt to untangle the rook on f8 and potentially support a later g5 push, aiming to destabilize white's newly solidified pawn structure. Relocating the king offers a degree of safety, creating a subtle but important diagonal escape route should the queenside pressure intensify. The queen now ventures into the heart of white's position, aiming to exploit the weaknesses that have opened up around the king, particularly the e-file and the weak pawn on g2. Asserting control over the queenside and potentially initiating a queenside pawn storm, this knight repositioning aims to disrupt black's solidifying structure and probe for weaknesses around the enemy king. The exchange of queens here decisively simplifies the position, steering the game towards an endgame where black's compromised kingside structure becomes a significant concern. Reactivating the rook to its home file, this maneuver prepares to contest the now open column, aiming to exert pressure on black's weakened kingside structure and potentially exploit the isolated pawn. Reactivating the rook on the open file, black aims to challenge white's spatial advantage and potentially create counterplay on the kingside, perhaps targeting the weakened structure around the white king after that earlier pawn capture. Pushing the d-pawn now carves out a dominant central space for white's pieces, potentially strangling black's kingside and restricting the mobility of the knight on f8. Pondering the spatial implications of this pawn thrust, black aims to disrupt white's queenside influence and prepare for further pawn advances, potentially opening lines for the rook on the file. The knight's repositioning to a3 isn't about immediate attack, but rather a subtle shift in influence, aiming to bolster control over the central dark squares and potentially prepare a queenside expansion. Asserting control over the central e-file becomes paramount now, a vital artery for piece activity and potential breakthroughs, while simultaneously preparing to contest the newly opened d-file. Shifting the knight to c2 initiates a patient regrouping maneuver, aiming to redeploy it to a more active square, perhaps e3, to bolster the center and pressure black's queenside. Opening a path for the knight to the kingside, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's coordination and potentially exploit the slightly exposed white king. Disrupting black's potentially strong kingside battery with this exchange simplifies the position and clears the f-file, opening avenues for immediate pressure. Accepting the doubled pawns with the king now exposed on g7 creates immediate vulnerabilities, forcing a strategic reassessment of black's defensive structure. This rook activation targets the g-file, seeking to pry open lines of attack towards black's recently exposed king. The black king, now exposed on g6, becomes a tantalizing target for white's advancing pieces, potentially initiating a swift attack down the g-file. Challenging the pinned knight with this aggressive pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's defensive structure and potentially expose the king on the kingside. The knight's return to g5 injects a fresh wave of complications into the position, aiming to exploit the now exposed kingside and create attacking possibilities against white's monarch. A crucial repositioning, aiming to activate the rook on a more dynamic diagonal and potentially support a kingside advance, while also challenging black's surprisingly entrenched pieces. Initiating a desperate counterattack, black sacrifices pawn structure for activity, aiming to exploit the open king and weak squares white has inadvertently created on the kingside by pushing the f-pawn. Securing the king's escape route from the knight's probing attack while simultaneously bolstering the pawn structure on the kingside is the primary aim of this maneuver. Injecting a knight into the tangled pawn structure now is a bold gambit, seeking to exploit the exposed monarch, though it risks immediate tactical complications if the opponent finds the right counterplay. Liberating the rook from its blocked position, this knight exchange initiates a battle for central dominance. Seizing the open file, black injects renewed life into the position by activating their rook, threatening to infiltrate white's territory and exploit the slightly exposed monarch. A stark reminder that even after a queen exchange, tactical skirmishes can quickly ignite. Preparing to shift the rook across the board, white aims to double forces on the kingside, targeting black's somewhat exposed monarch and potentially opening lines for an attack. Unleashing the pawn storm, black aggressively pushes forward, aiming to disrupt white's entrenched position and create vital attacking diagonals for their pieces. Finally, white embraces the open h-file, unleashing a counterattack against black's compromised kingside pawn structure. Releasing the pinned knight allows the rook to immediately pressure the 7th rank, creating a dynamic imbalance where black's rook aggressively seeks counterplay on an open file, while white must carefully navigate the potential for tactical skirmishes initiated by this bold advance. The white pawn now occupies a crucial central square, opening a path for the king to become more active in the ensuing endgame and simultaneously threatening to blockade black's isolated queenside pawns. The immediate confrontation of rooks on the fourth rank forces a critical decision regarding the control of the open files that will emerge. A bold advance, sacrificing pawn structure to open a swift assault along the f-file, aiming to exploit the exposed black king. The black king, having emerged from its castled haven and now exposed, immediately seizes an opportunity to rejoin the fray. A risky, but perhaps necessary step to contest the central space and avoid being completely marginalized by white's active pieces. Unleashing the rook's power to exploit the exposed black king, now that the pawn barrier has fractured, seeking to dominate the central files and pry open lines towards the monarch's haven. Reluctantly admitting defeat, the black king scrambles for shelter, a forlorn monarch in a collapsing fortress, seeking sanctuary from the relentless pursuit of its white counterpart and the looming specter of the opened f-file. This relocation of the rook to the 8th rank intensifies pressure on black's weakened kingside and exploits the open file for potential breakthroughs, all while maintaining a secure defensive structure behind the pawn chain. The knight's daring leap towards the king's former sanctuary opens a complex tactical situation, potentially disrupting white's rook superiority by targeting the f3 pawn and threatening discovered attacks. This final rook maneuver aims to disrupt black's precarious pawn structure and potentially infiltrate into black's territory, exploiting the weakened squares around the black king. Seeking to activate its recently freed rook, black aims to occupy the 2nd rank, hoping to cause trouble for white's king and pawns and perhaps create an outpost on c2. Unleashing the knight to d4 injects immediate pressure, aiming to disrupt black's surprisingly well-coordinated pieces and seize control of the central dark squares. The black rook ventures onto the 2nd rank, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and potentially create a passed pawn down the central files. Opening a pathway for the knight to a crucial outpost on d4 or e6 fundamentally reshapes the battlefield's dynamic, potentially initiating a decisive attack. Seeking a vital outpost to disrupt white's rook activity and potentially create counterplay on the kingside. Unleashing a final check, white aims to dislodge the black king from its defensive post, forcing a reaction that could expose its weaknesses in this rapidly simplifying position. The black monarch, now exposed to the rook's relentless pressure, desperately scrambles for safety, but the open g-file offers little respite, and the advanced white knight on f3 seems poised to exploit any weakness that arises.